Hey there, it's Rebecca. This week I have a bit of a different setup. I've done book reviews in the past and I kind of wanted to revisit that. This week I am doing a bit of a review and just a discussion, as much of a discussion as you can have by yourself in a room, of So Pretty, Very Rotten by Jane Ma and Nguyen. It is a book that was published by Koyama Press very recently, I think in the last year. If that's wrong, I'll fix that right here. It is a collection of comics, essays, and I guess academic papers, as well as interviews with prominent people in the Lolita community. For people who aren't completely aware of what Lolita is, it is a street fashion that originated in Japan. One of the people they interview sort of pins it to sort of the late 70s and 80s at its prominence. It's tied to sort of musical communities like Visual Kei, and takes a lot of inspiration from Rococo art and culture. So it's very opulent, very feminine, very frilly, very invested in sort of like a sensory and indulgent experience of life. So what I like about this book is that it really starts out from the ground and builds up. It gives the reader sort of an introduction to what Lolita is, the term, the different articles of clothing, sort of that vocabulary you need to know in terms of navigating the stories they're telling about Lolita. And it also gives a really fantastic rundown of how a street fashion or fashion subculture communicates, how these ideas originate in one country from a very specific cultural context, like Japanese street fashion, and sort of ends up spreading to the rest of the world. Because currently, and in the past, probably I would say the last 10 years, Lolita has really proliferated online, sort of creating a very international community and creating sort of its own market for these clothing. It outlines genres or corners of Lolita, whether that's gothic Lolita or sweet Lolita or some more subdued ones like otome. I think it's very different from a lot of books that are published in sort of the indie comic scene. It's really big. It also involves a little bit more reading, and I actually really like it for that reason. It has a good amount of comics in it, but it also has, as I said, academic essays, sort of personal anecdotes and stories from Jane and Anne. I think this is very important historically. You know, there are things that you can't find in any other book. They interview very prominent Lolitas that basically formed what Lolita is today. They interview Novala Takemoto, who wrote Kamikaze Girls, which is maybe I should do a whole thing on that film, because after finishing this, I immediately went and rewatched Kamikaze Girls, and if you haven't seen that, it's amazing. Even if you give no fucks about fashion, it's a fantastic and very funny film. So what I personally really enjoyed about this book, and it's the central thesis of the book. I mean, it's right in the title, So Pretty, Very Rotten. These are completely sort of ideas that are at odds with one another. That is sort of the tone, especially through the more personal aspects where Anne and Jane are speaking from personal experience, and especially through the comics, there seems to be this tension between these lighthearted, beautiful parts of being Lolita, so expressing yourself. They talk a lot about the idea of these layers of petticoats, and that a lot of times the people who embrace Lolita tend to be maybe quiet and shy, and so it's sort of flipping on the head the idea that femininity is something that is quiet and fluid, so it always flows around others and is very accommodating. And Lolita, while it is the most hyper feminine style you can embody, because it's so large, because it just takes up space, it's so subversive in that way. And this idea that you don't have to be aggressive to be present, and to be intimidating. So there's that aspect of it. Curating, sort of the joy of aesthetics, the joy of sort of reveling in the moment of being with your friends and feeling luxurious, and creating this world that's completely your own, that's full of light and love. So that's one side of Lolita, and it's somewhat discussed, but I think it's much more of a feeling in the comics that there's this darker sense of consumerist buying clothes, this idea that, you know, you start out falling in love with this and wanting to be in these communities and wanting to sort of exist as your like best self, sort of epitomizing this like ideal version of yourself through these clothes. It seems like there's a honeymoon phase, and then there's something where the darker aspects of what it is, what you're sort of reaching for, like that hunger is still there, and once you've satiated this hunger, like you're almost like empty. There's one comic called Empty that I think deals with that. Wow, I'm sweating a lot. It's so hot in here. Kind of feels like a disillusionment that sometimes happens, where it becomes too pent up in the acquisition of objects. You know, it can become sort of consumerist, very focused on money eventually, because a lot of these objects, I mean, dresses, the full, you know, all the different elements are something that you have to invest so heavily in. And so just by the nature of that, you have to become, there's a materialism to it. I like that there's no judgment on that, but there's a very good discussion of what happens when we become too focused on accumulation and not necessarily on what these beautifully crafted things sort of bring to our own life. Yeah, so I like that, and so a lot of the comics sort of deal with that. That's the part that I relate to. I love anime, I do love cute culture, I love fashion, and there is maybe a little bit of guilt that you just love something that's completely based on objects, and sometimes you forget that maybe it is about the craftsmanship and the creativity behind it, and it becomes maybe second nature and much more to do with like shopping. In terms of like Lolita, I think it's really interesting that Lolita is a very weird balance between how consumerism oddly can sometimes actually bring a sense of personal development. So I would give this 4 out of 5 sweaty lacy ladies. 4 out of 5, and not a 5 because I think it would have really benefited from some photographs. You know, I think it's very obvious that the writers love this culture, just have a wealth of information about it. But because it's such a visual art form, because there's so much emphasis put on the care, like there's so much obsessive care and love put into these outfits, and each coordinate is sort of just a moment in time. I would have liked to see photographs of Jane and Anne in their garb. I would have liked to see photographs of them maybe sweaty, like sitting with their friends at the meetups. I really wanted some very tangible sort of documenting it. The beginning of the book focuses so much on getting a reader that's never come across Lolita up to speed, that for someone to really understand it, you really need to see the street snaps, right? You need to see it in context of them being on the streets of Tokyo or at the meetups, and that's just, you can't really get that concreteness, right? It's not quite real without the photos. Maybe it was just a case of like getting the rights to images was very difficult, but that was the one thing. I could have used some photos. To someone who's completely out of the loop, there's a bit of a knowledge bias where there's maybe some assumptions made that sort of newcomers just have no idea what they're talking about. I came out with sort of a renewed sense of personal responsibility, I guess, to, you know, take every day and have as much fun as you can, to express yourself, to not be afraid of being visible and very present when you're walking around in whatever way that is, whether it's fashion or how you're speaking to people, or, you know, your posture, or just being proud of yourself in every moment. You know, it really left me with a sense that, you know, you really want to stage a bit of a revolution in any way you can, sort of every day of your life. And I'm very grateful for that. It brought me back to a wonderful place and made me want to forge ahead. So if you're at all interested in getting this book, I'm going to put links for Koyama Press in the description, as well as Anne and Jane's information, because they're also independent artists that are doing amazing things and great scholarship. So you should definitely check them out. If you're a Lolita yourself and you've read the book, if you have different ideas, definitely put it in a comment. Anyway, thank you so much for watching my video, and I'll see you next week. See you later.